Out of every God Hand member in existence, the one that intrigues us the most is also the one that is the most talkative of the bunch. That's right, we're discussing the silver-tongued, slick-talking devil himself, Ubik the Manipulator. At first glance, he appears to be the most welcoming of the demonic bunch, what with his perma-grin and his admittedly cool spiked sunglasses. But then he opens his mouth and you realize that this guy is probably the worst of the bunch because he's just such a master at gaslighting folks. Ubik is the guy the God Hand usually assigns the task of convincing promised ones to abandon their humanity and embrace evil as their dogma. And he does an excellent job of it. But a lot of what he does is related to his anatomy and also his name, which is a reference to a sci-fi novel you'll be learning about shortly. So, without further ado, let's answer all your questions about the flying half-octopus demon. This is Ubik's Anatomy. Explore. Before we get into our video, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you,
He's the only person
us,
in recorded history to unite the continent of man.
He's the smallest of the bunch, but he has the biggest role among them. Ubik's introduction to Berserk. Like the rest of his demon angel brethren, Ubik graces us with his sinister presence towards the tail end of the chapter titled Guardian Angels of Desire Part 4, which itself is part of the Black Swordsman arc. Each member of the God Hand has their own unique design that makes them stand apart as characters in their own right, but Ubik stands out even amongst this demonic bunch for two reasons. Number one, he's tiny, less than a third of the size of Femto. In front of the rest of his kinsmen, he looks like a garden gnome with glasses, or rather a dwarf with tentacles, and number two, he's never seen not levitating in the air. Ubik makes his debut within an asymmetrical interstitial space, floating upside down, which might actually be the right way up. We just don't know how physics works in the astral world. Everything about him feels out of place in a dimension that is already pretty out there, especially his smile. Ubik is the only member of the God Hand to have a perma-grin stuck to his face, and while that's an obvious homage to his inspiration from Hellraiser, Chatterer, there's a far more sinister reason attached to Ubik's smile compared to Chatterer, who, well, didn't quite have a choice but to flash his 32. Let's just leave it at that. But now that we've brought up his appearance, let's talk about it a little, because Ubik certainly is unique in that the only human parts of his anatomy are his face and his hands. Every other member of the God Hand looks at least vaguely human, but Ubik looks entirely inhuman, especially when you consider the fact that he doesn't walk, floats. Where there should be a torso, hips, and legs, there are tentacles instead, all of which resemble leaf-like fins and presumably help Ubik stay afloat. His hands remain in a clasped position like a preacher's, which goes well aesthetically with the cardinal hood at the back of his head. And speaking of his head, it might be human, but it's just as unsettling as Void's in its own way. Ubik might not have stripped back skin, his brain might not be exposed, his eyelids might not be sewn shut, but he looks the most like a human being besides Slan in the God Hand when you zoom in on his face. He has a round chubby face, which is complemented well by his round spiked sunglasses. He has a squat nose and a hint of a double chin, but the most striking feature of his face, which we've already mentioned multiple times, is his smile. Ubik is constantly grinning, and that is far more unsettling to us than any other demonic design Miura's Berserk has to offer. And here's why. What is a smile? No, really think about it. A smile is usually used as an expression of joy, right? You and I smile when we feel happy, right? Now ask yourself, why in the world would anyone be happy to exist as a demon? Or, better yet, let's think about it this way. What happens when you have a bad day and you don't want your friend or your partner to worry about you? You tend to hide it all behind a big, wide smile. Sociopaths and psychopaths are thought of as being individuals with emotional deficiencies, yet they clearly understand the meaning of social gestures because they often use something as simple as a smile to lure their targets or intimidate them. So the meaning behind something that is meant to be associated with joy ends up being corrupted when it's used for anything besides its intended purpose. And Ubik's smile gives us the creeps, because we know from the get-go that this guy is no friend of ours, no matter how hard he tries to act like it. And acting like your friend is part of the reason why Ubik is also more sinister than the rest of his compeers. Because while the rest of the God Hand prefers to do things directly and bluntly, Ubik has no problem talking to you and taking his time, which further enhances that image of a friendly helper in the minds of whoever hears him speaking. Also, speaking is what he mainly does, but that's not just a character thing, there's an anatomical reason for it as well. So let's get straight into that, shall we? He exchanged his body flesh for the powers of a psychic spray can, understanding Ubik's unique anatomy. Like every other God Hand member, Ubik was, at one point in his existence, a human being. We think he was probably a preacher of some sort given his current appearance and attire, but that's a discussion for another video. If you guys have seen any of our videos on the God Hand, you know that we have a running theory that the order in which they appear during the eclipse is the order in which they all ascended to God Handhood, in reverse chronological fashion. Ubik appears right after Slan does, which puts his ascendance smack dab in the middle of the current God Hand, given that a God Hand member only ascends once every cycle of 216 years. At some point during his human life, Ubik came across a Crimson Behelit. If he was a preacher, like we're assuming he was, he must have had a lot of subjects that revered him for spreading the word of God through the lands. It's possible that due to his preachings, Ubik was imprisoned and tortured in his human life, as that seems to be a common theme, at least with the God Hand members we do know of. Once he reached a sufficiently low point and despaired so hard at his condition that all he desired was the power to make it go away, his blood and his thoughts and feelings all flowed into the Crimson Behelit, which activated his eclipse ceremony. This opened a fissure in his heart, which linked his very existence to the abyss. Ubik too was faced with the choice that Griffith was faced with from chapters 75 through 79. Should he sacrifice those people who defined his humanity and were a part of his very soul? Or should he accept his pitiful existence as a powerless man? Clearly, he chose the former, because we know he's a God Hand member, and once he chanted the words necessary for making a demonic sacrifice, all the people he offered up were marked by the brand of sacrifice, which marked the beginning of the end for Ubik as a human. From this point, we imagine things played out rather similarly to how they did for Griffith. Once Ubik committed himself to the God Hand, the hand that represents their altar closes around his physical body and puts it in a luminescent cocoon within which you can see it morph into what would end up becoming his current appearance. His astral body in the meantime sank straight into the abyss, feeling the souls of the people he had sacrificed pierce through it and the essence of evil surge into his body that was going through a metamorphosis as his astral self sank deeper. Once it reached the abyss and understood the maxim of all life on Earth from the idea of evil, Ubik was given the choice to select his own form and given the command to do as he wills. We cannot stress enough that he chose to look like a flying half-octopus as the idealized version of himself, devoid of any of his previous human emotions, aka weaknesses. As a massive body of thought, Ubik no longer existed within the physical world, but he had gained a significant position within the astral realm. He was now one of the 5 blessed demon kings, and Ubik's anatomy is an integral part of the God Hand's plans for apostles and the rest of demonkind, even more so than the natural master-servant relationship coded into the genes of God Hand members and apostles respectively. See, Ubik is named after Philip K. Dick's 1969 novel, Ubik, which is a story all about psychic powers and the human mind. In Ubik, humanity has colonized the moon and gained access to psychic powers which can only be blocked by people known as the Neutrals. The protagonist is one such neutral, but that's not all. Apparently, humans can also exist in a state of half-life, where once they've died, their bodies are cryogenically preserved and kept in a sort of life trance. Half-life is basically a link between human existence and the subconscious beyond it, and at one point, the protagonist ends up entering this realm himself. Turns out, the actual villain of the story is a guy who eats other people's half-lives to make himself stronger, and the only way to protect oneself from such a deletion is by using a spray can called, you guessed it, Ubik. The novel itself is an amazing read, and we recommend that you check it out when you get the time to do so, but what's important for us is the consciousness bit, because as it turns out, Miura pretty much lifted that from Philip Dick's work and turned it into Ubik's primary ability. The reason why we called Ubik's smile even more disturbing than Void's exposed brain is because he uses it to hide his true intent, the manipulation of your intentions. Every God Hand member seems to possess a certain blanket amount of powers thanks to the essence of evil that powers their inhuman anatomies. For instance, all God Hand members can interpret the flow of causality to a certain extent, though that may vary depending on the God Hand we're talking about. It has been constantly implied by the series that Void can see the flow of causality better than his counterparts, but they're no slouches themselves, being able to predict 99.9% of everything that happens. The only thing to have really caught the God Hand by surprise is the fact that Guts and Casca survived the eclipse, something Ubik seems delighted by because he probably hadn't considered something that unforeseeable actually taking place in front of his eyes. And that's because Ubik's main job as part of his demonic crew is to nudge causality into taking hold of the fate of the person who summoned the God Hand in the first place. We've only ever seen the God Hand play out their elaborate causality convincing routine twice in the series, but both times, Ubik has been the one to actually do most of the convincing. Usually, the rest of the God Hand would spout out philosophical lines about accepting the evils within one's heart, and how compared to the powers one gains, the sacrifices are negligible. And while Ubik does that too, he takes it a step further by kind of forcing people to accept their inner darkness. Kentaro Miura was heavily influenced by Carl Jung in the formation of the basis of his world building, and the astral world is pretty much a Jungian playground. Jung was a firm believer in the fact that every person harbored within themselves the capacity to do both good and evil, and that it was just a matter of indulging the right side that formed the concept of morality. He was also a proponent of the collective subconscious, which is basically what the astral world is in the context of Berserk. But while the rest of the God Hand tries to pressure the people who summoned them into accepting their deal and becoming bound in service to demonkind in the idea of evil, Ubik takes the more humanitarian approach. The reason we've been focusing on his deceptive smile so much is because from behind that veil of friendliness, Ubik uses his target's own subconscious to manipulate them into accepting the God Hand's deal. During the Black Swordsman arc, the God Hand initially tries to pressure the Slug Count into accepting their deal and sacrificing his daughter instead of Guts as a means to ascend again. Now granted, Guts had already been offered up once, and the Count didn't personally hate the guy, which was an important factor in demonic rituals, but the approach the God Hand took cannot be called the carrot approach for sure. Femto was out there telling the Count to cast his love asunder, for crying out loud. But when he saw that the Count wasn't willing to give up his daughter for all the usual reasons, Ubik stepped in and decided to jog his memory and give everyone present a look into what happened the last time. He used his powers to project a piece of the Count's subconscious into the interstice for everyone to see, and what everyone saw was a veritable nightmare. Teresia learned that her mother didn't mysteriously die, her dad killed her, because she was secretly a pagan cultist. But what's worse is the Count killed her by sacrificing her to the God Hand and the idea of evil, which is how he became an apostle in the first place. All while this was being shown to the people gathered in the interstice, Ubik gave cutting, running commentary on how the Count was the one who made the choice to give up the woman he loved to become a demonic slug monster. And now that he had exposed this fact to the only person that still defined the remnants of his humanity, his daughter, Ubik had perhaps hoped to break the Count into accepting the God Hand's deal anyway. The opposite ends up happening, and the Count ended up in the abyss, but this was the first time we saw Ubik's anatomical powers come into play. And yes, consciousness projection is something that's enabled by his anatomy. Because Ubik exists as a body of thought, he is able to peer into the thoughts and emotions of others, and draw them out and twist them in ways that seem natural, but are carefully engineered to coax people into being associated with demonkind. We see the best example of a successful Ubik mind projection during Griffith's eclipse, where he manages to invade the young man's psyche and convince him that slaughter and bloodshed in exchange for that dazzling castle in the sky is what he had always truly wanted. This is patently untrue because we've seen Griffith risking his life and reputation for his comrades on numerous occasions, but Ubik frames things in such a way that it ends up making sense to Griffith. He gaslights Griffith into accepting that he had always known he'd end up getting thousands killed in his conquest, but he then manipulated Griffith into accepting that that was his true nature. Well, not manipulated as much as pushed him into accepting that fact, but you get our point. Ubik is the definition of a silver-tongued devil. He's got the gift of gab, and he can gab for centuries if he wants to. He even disguises himself as the fortune teller Griffith met in his youth that gave him his crimson behelit, just to push the idea that all of his life actions had been fated by causality further down his brain. In reality, if Griffith had simply rejected the God Hand's offer like the Slug Count did, he would not be a reviled Demon King today. We know that he had that option, because what was the point of showing us a rejected Ascension in the first arc of the series? What Ubik does is nudge people into accepting their shadow selves, and steals their commitment to that shadow self with his gaslighting words. He says things like they always knew this was their true face, but they rejected it because they were afraid. Well, now they have no reason to be afraid, because now they can get power, and power ends things like fear. It only works because Ubik exists as a massive body of thought, and while the other God Hand members might possess some form of psychic abilities of their own, we doubt those powers would be as effective as his. Everyone thinks that Ubik was inactive during the incarnation ceremony, but we think he played a massive role in enabling the whole thing. If Ubik's specialty is invading people's minds and exploiting their thoughts and emotions against them, wouldn't it make sense that Ubik be the one who sends the prophetic dream of the Falcon of Light to all adherents of the Holy See? Ubik has shown his control over the metaphysical side of existence already, and manipulating millions through their dreams sounds exactly like the sort of thing he'd do. Sure, he might not have been the metaphysical falcon that sliced off Zod's horn in chapter 128, but the rest of humanity could have sought Griffith as their salvation because of Ubik's mental manipulation. Just based off the things we've seen so far, Ubik is likely a representation of the dark side of human imagination. When he's manifested in the physical world following the great roar of the astral world, Ubik resides in a realm that looks an awful lot like the hell part of Hieronymus Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights triptych. It's a fitting choice from Mura, given that the God Hand were technically forged in hell, and this particular painting fits with his vision of the collective subconscious that forms the astral world. As for why that imagination manifests itself as a fin-shaped tentacle monster with sunglasses on its face, we don't know, but we imagine we'll find out at least part of that answer by the time the series comes to an end. As far as we know, Ubik can't use his tentacles to fight, but we're nothing if not suckers for surprise. Marvelous verdict! As for any questions you had regarding Ubik's anatomy, we hope we've answered those in this video. He's by far the most intriguing God Hand member in our opinion, because while he talks a lot of what he says is actually worthless in the grand scheme of things, and he's just constantly running a game on you. The fact that his existence as a massive body of thought enables him to do that on the subconscious level is sheer madness, and we imagine that's exactly what those ordained by the laws of causality experience when they're subjected to Ubik's song and dance. But keeping all that aside, what do you guys think of Ubik's anatomy? Let us know in the comments section down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep struggling, strugglers.